Our subject, Jack Bass on 2nd District, U.S. House seat. Our guest, Mr. Jack Bass, Democratic nominee for Congress, 2nd South Carolina District. Our interviewer, Dr. Morris Blachman, Professor of Government and International Studies at the University of South Carolina. And I'm your host, Reed Montgomery. Morris, you have the first question.
Well, Jack, I think one of the really interesting things about this campaign is that as a journalist, you've covered a number of campaigns and you have some idea of it. And what's more, as an author, and we have here a copy of your recent book, you've done a lot of work on Southern politics. And one of the interesting things to me, and I think to our viewers out there, would be to know, do you still feel the same way about Southern politics as you did when you wrote that book?
Well, there are things one learns as a candidate about politics that there's no other way to learn. But basically, yes, I basically agree with what we wrote in the book. And what we found in that book, we traveled 40,000 miles in all 11 states of the Confederacy, interviewed more than 360 people, including 29 members of Congress. And the conclusion of the book really is that throughout the South, and I think the 2nd District is very typical of the whole South, and I say that because it's a district that has a large urban population, large suburban, it's 7 counties, there's a large rural area, there are many small towns. And throughout the South, we found that people are basically proud throughout the South of having faced up to and confronted and made adjustments to some very difficult and very rapid social change. We haven't solved all of our problems, and we know that, but we've come a long way.
Jack, since you've written about a lot of politics and politicians, I'm sure you probably had some categories of politicians. Now that you are one, what kind of category or what kind of slot would you say you fill?
I guess I fill the slot of the outstanding politician.
Okay. Outstanding in what way, Jack?
No, really, I don't know how I'd categorize myself except to say that basically I'm a moderate Democrat. And I think I fit into the same category as the new members being elected from the South who are Democrats. They tend to be moderate, they tend to be mildly progressive. I think it's the next, it's the next wave of leadership, political leadership in the country is coming out of these new congressmen being elected from the South. I'm thinking people like Senator Dale Bumpers from Arkansas, people like many of our own congressional delegation.
That's a kind of interesting notion, Jack. If you consider yourself that way, I assume that's meant to convey some idea of where you stand. And as you well know, Congressman Spence has indicated that you have been attacking his record, but you haven't said very much about where Jack Bass stands. I thought maybe you might clarify a little bit for us. Where does Jack Bass stand on major issues?
Well, I think, when I attack his record, if I criticize things that he has voted for, the clear implication is that I differ from him on these issues. And I have attacked his record on consumer issues, for example. I believe the federal government should play an active role in protecting consumers. He has voted against that. He has gotten 0 ratings 3 times in 7 years from the Consumer Federation of America. And I differ with him on that. He says that he does it to fight inflation, and yet at the same time, he voted in 1975 to continue the oil depletion allowance, which meant a $2 billion a year subsidy to the oil industry. He got a 0 rating last year from the National Council of Senior Citizens. I believe in programs to allow senior citizens to live lives of dignity and meaning. I believe particularly in programs where the federal government works in partnership with private nonprofit groups on programs such as in housing. And there's a real need for senior citizens in housing in this area. I've talked to Sheriff Frank Powell in Richland County, for example, and he has told me that there's problems of people living alone and frequently in inadequate housing, and it is a real problem for them. Sometimes they live in fear, for example. And so there are a number of areas in which he and I disagree. And there's some areas where he and I agree, but when I discuss his voting record, it's usually to bring out where we differ. For example, he supports deregulation of natural gas. I oppose that. And I oppose it because I think it will be inflationary. Natural gas prices have gone up 400% since 1970. They'll go up another 350% by 1985 if we deregulate it. Now, what that means is that the price will double, then it will redouble, and then it will go up some more. And it's going to have a devastating effect on people on fixed incomes, especially senior citizens, especially people in lower incomes, but it's going to have a very much of an inflationary effect. It's going to increase costs for industry, particularly the textile industry, and I oppose deregulation.
Well, Jack, one thing here maybe you can clarify a little bit, because I've heard both you and Congressman Spence talk about the fact that you're concerned about inflation. I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit more about how you see a difference between you and him, since both of you are opposed to inflation.
We are. I think everyone's opposed to inflation. The question is, what can we do to effectively combat inflation? I frankly think that new faces in Congress who can bring all kinds of people together to fight this problem. I think we need to bring workers together, management together, business and government all together, and we're going to have to take some tough steps, and everyone may have to tighten their belts a little bit on this. One proposal I've made, and it's not a particularly popular issue politically, with some people it's very unpopular, but I think it would have an effect on inflation. I proposed holding federal employees, for example, to a 4% pay raise instead of a 6%. Now, this would save $3 billion. It would also set an example for the private sector. It would cost no jobs, and I don't think it would even hurt federal employees, because if it resulted in holding down inflation, and I think it would help them in that respect, and part of the rest of their raise would go to higher taxes anyway.
Jack, one of the things we spend a lot of money on is national defense. That's a big item in our budget. Would you have any feeling about what you do about that kind of spending?
Well, this is an area where Congressman Spence and I happen to agree for the most part. I'm a retired commander in the Naval Air Reserve with more than 1,000 hours of flight time. I think another nuclear carrier would be good, and there are reasons I favor that, for increased mobility and other reasons. At the same time, well, first let me say I think that the United States can afford to be second to no other nation in terms of national defense. But at the same time, we have to cut out waste in the Department of Defense, just as we have to cut out waste in every agency of government. And I think that is going to be essential, and that is one of the areas in which I'm most interested, is in cutting out waste.
Jack, let me go back to this issue of your record for a minute, if I could, and Congressman Spence's record. Congressman Spence says that you attack his record. He attacks your attacking of his record, and he has stated that he doesn't quite understand, or he finds that you are attacking bits and pieces of his record rather than looking at the whole thing. You talk about amendments, but maybe not all of his votes. How would you respond to this?
Oh, I think that's sort of played something called the final passage game. That, for example, on the Sunshine Law that passed, this is to make government meetings open to the public, so that the press can cover it, so people can be informed. I think people have a right to know. There were 3 major amendments on that bill to weaken the bill. He voted every time for the amendment to weaken the bill. Then on final passage, it passed 387 to nothing. He says he favors government in the sunshine. He passed for the law. He voted on final passage for the bill. Of course, last year on the National Energy Act, he voted against it on final passage. He was the only South Carolina congressman who voted against it on final passage, and we still don't have an Energy Act. We still don't have an energy policy in this nation.
Jack, you said that the 2nd District is kind of like the South. Are there any special appeals that a candidate has to make to any what we might call minority groups, which could be a lot of different kinds of groups of people? How do you see this as a factor in campaigning and in the election?
I say the same thing to all groups, really, and make basically the same type of speeches. I respond to the questions of any group, and the questions may vary. A business group may have different questions from another group, for example. But what I find, and I've been listening to voters in South Carolina for 15 years as a journalist. I've been covering campaigns, and I've been talking directly to voters and conversing them in this campaign for almost 5 months now. And what I find is that people want government services. They want them effectively and efficiently delivered. And what they want is an end to waste in government. They're tired of a bureaucracy that they feel has grown impersonal, that there's too much red tape, that the bureaucracy has grown too fat, really. And I think people are tired of government interference in their personal lives.
Well, are you going to be able to provide them an alternative to this impersonal bureaucracy? What will Jack Bass do in Congress so that the average South Carolinian, myself, Montgomery, anybody else that might be out there who wants something, wants to talk to their congressman, are you really going to be different?
I don't know if I'll be different. I can only tell you what I'll do. One thing I'll do, I'll publish my voting record on a regular basis, every 2 weeks, every month, and any resident of the 2nd District who wants it, I'll mail it to them. But I'm not going to clutter their mails, you know, with regular, what I consider frequently sort of junk mail that's franked at taxpayers' expense on a regular basis and goes to every voter. But anyone who wants information, they'll get it. In addition to that, I plan to spend a great deal of time in the district during recess periods and for example, and to go into the towns throughout the 2nd District and to have meetings and forums that any citizen can attend and can ask questions. I think people want to know what's going on in Washington. They want to ask, and I want to hear from them. I want to listen to them. I want to listen to their questions, and I want to listen to their responses if I have questions of them.
Jack, one of the things, too, that impresses me a little bit about a congressman or a senator is that he has maybe 1 or 2 roles that he can play. He can represent his people and get jobs for people in his district and do favors for them, or else he can be a kind of a national figure. How do you see that as your role, for example? Would you be asking people in polls so that you get a consensus and then take your stand on the basis of consensus, or do you think a congressman should take a leadership role nationally, for example?
Well, Reed, I think they're 2 separate roles, but I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think you have to play both roles. I plan to hire people for my staff who really want to be of service. And I think any voter, any citizen in the 2nd District should be able to go to their congressman if they have a problem with any agency of federal government and get prompt, effective, efficient, and courteous service. That's one part of it. The other part of it, I think there should be leadership from the congressman, and I think as a member of Congress, I would hope that I would be better informed than the average citizen back home. I think that's part of the job, and I'm going to be listening to the people back home. But if I feel something is definitely in the national interest that even a majority of the people on occasion may oppose, I think I should vote in favor of what I believe to be in the national interest.
Jack, you mentioned that you think leadership is important. Can you elaborate on that for a minute? What would you do as a leader? I mean, what would that mean?
Okay, I'll just give you one example. One issue that I have raised as a candidate that very, very few political candidates have raised because it's complex and it's controversial, and this is the question of nuclear waste disposal. And I think I was one of the first people to really raise this issue. We now have 25 million gallons of radioactive, liquefied nuclear waste buried in temporary storage containers in an earthquake-prone area in South Carolina. The reason it's buried in temporary storage containers is that 35 years ago, they thought in 30 to 35 years the problem would be solved. It hasn't been solved. And what I've proposed is a national task force of the nation's leading scientists, equivalent to the same type of scientific task force that developed the atomic bomb to now deal with this problem of nuclear waste. It's going to be radioactive for 50,000 to 100,000 years. It's something we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to come up with a solution, and the longer we delay it, the more it's going to cost.
Well, now I've heard a lot of people say that they're concerned about that, and I've also heard a lot of people say that even though they're concerned about it, they worry we've got to have nuclear energy. How would you go about dealing with the energy crisis if you don't favor, sort of going straight out completely all nuclear?
Well, I'm not opposed to nuclear energy, first of all, and I think we need additional research, particularly on fusion. What we now have is fission, which creates a considerable amount of waste material. If we develop fusion to the point that we can use fusion reactors, the waste factor goes down to about 1% of what you get from fission. In addition to that, you have an almost inexhaustible supply of fuel because the fuel for a fission reactor comes out of seawater. But not only do we have nuclear waste as a problem, I mean, my position is I don't want South Carolina to become the nation's nuclear waste dumping ground, and I don't want South Carolina to become the septic tank for the nation's toxic industrial waste either, and I'm concerned about that.
Jack, what about this the whole broad issue of energy? You've mentioned some of that. What kind of would be your energy program, you think, for the United States? What are some of the things that we can do to take care of the future, for example?
Okay, I favor continued research and development of solar energy. And just a couple of years ago, Mr. Spence voted against a $28 million appropriation for solar energy research. At the same time, when he was voting to give the the oil companies a $2 billion annual subsidy, and to me that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I happen to be tired of being ripped off by the oil companies, and I think we have been. I don't have any, grandiose solution for it, but I think we need to develop alternative energy sources. We need to develop sources that are renewable. We need to work on conservation, and I think this can be done.
Jack, let me change a little bit of what we're talking about here. One of the things I've noted in looking at the campaign so far is that there's been very little discussion of foreign policy. Now, we were up to our elbows and beyond in foreign policy a few months ago, and everybody was talking about the Panama Canal and those treaties, and there's been some discussion of a new SALT agreement, but basically foreign policy doesn't seem to have been an issue in this campaign. Why is that? Isn't foreign policy important right now?
Well, foreign policy is obviously important, but I think it's not particularly an issue because I think people in the 2nd District at the moment are much more concerned about domestic issues, especially about inflation, but especially in other areas. And in addition to that, Mr. Spence has never really taken any leadership in the area of foreign policy, and I'm not sure exactly where he stands on most foreign policy issues.
Jack, what about the relationship of your campaign to the Democratic Party nationally? Do you expect maybe to have President Carter come down on your behalf? Or I'm sure you've already maybe been at his place. Are his coattails any good any longer?
I don't know if his coattails are any good or not, but he would not be coming down here on my behalf. He is coming to South Carolina, of course, on Bug Ravenel's behalf, and I expect to greet him at the airport at that time. If some other high administration official would like to come down on my behalf, it may or may not happen. But basically, I'm running the campaign as Jack Bass, the nominee of the Democratic Party, who was selected by the voters in the 2nd District in the Democratic primary.
Jack, when you get up to Congress, have you given any thought to any areas in which you would like to take particular leadership? That is, any particular committees you would want to be on, or where you think you might best serve the 2nd District?
I guess if there's a single area in which I'm most interested, it would be in the area of energy.
In the area of energy.
And that's where you'd like. What committee assignment would that give you, Jack, for example?
There are several different House committees that deal with energy. I'm also very much interested in the whole question of health care delivery.
It's changing the subject just a little bit, Jack, but as a political scientist, I guess you would consider yourself that. Do you see, how do you see the possibility of our having, for example, all Democrats from South Carolina? I'm sure for the 2nd Congressional District you got a good, clear position on that. Is it a good thing for South Carolina to move toward a two-party system, or is it good to have all one party?
Let me say first, I don't consider myself to be a political scientist,
Okay.
Reed.
Okay. I thought you were practical.
I have been a political analyst and a political reporter as a journalist for a number of years. But getting back to your question, no, I think it's good to have a two-party system, and I favor that for South Carolina. But I think the question then becomes competition between the two parties. And as far as the 2nd District is concerned, I think I can provide far more effective representation in Congress as a Democrat who can work effectively with other moderate Democrats in a Congress that's controlled by moderate Democrats. And also, I do have friends in the White House. And I think that's good also. And in doing my book, I know a number of people in Washington. I've known every member of Congress from South Carolina since before any of them went to Congress, with the exception of Senator Thurman, of course.
Jack, you mentioned just a minute ago that one of your areas of interest had to do with health. What do you see as resolution to these kinds of problems that are coming up now in terms of various health plans? Do you have any ideas on what might be an adequate role for the federal government in regard to health?
I think it's going to be several years before we end up with, a real plan on which a consensus is reached. There are a number of different proposals that have been raised, and I think that, the objective that people really want is they want health care that's available and that's affordable. And I think we have to work to a system that provides that.
Was there any danger, Jack, that we're going to run into some sort of bankruptcy and some of these things they've talked about once in a while about Social Security not being safe and this kind of thing? Any feelings you have along that direction?
Mr. Spence voted against the Social Security tax increase, and I think at the time that tax increase was passed, it was necessary to keep the Social Security system solvent. Now, one way of dealing with that problem on Social Security is we now have Medicaid is funded by the Social Security program, and I think Medicaid, which takes about 16% of the total Social Security budget, should be funded out of general revenue, and that would reduce the demand that's made on the Social Security system. No, I think the Social Security system will definitely remain solvent, and I think Congress is responsible enough to see that it does remain solvent.
How do you...
One quickie in that
Sure.
same regard, Morris. What about national health, extending it on, such as Senator Kennedy would like for us to do? How do you feel about that? Just moving toward a full national health program.
This is what I was referring to when I said there's several different proposals. I lean to some sort of a partnership arrangement. The details are just going to have to be worked out on that. You know, I don't foresee a system in which doctors are told they can't practice here, they must practice there. I don't think we're going to have anything like that. At the same time, we do need to cut costs. We do need to simplify the bookkeeping aspects of it. We do need to cut out fraud and these sort of things. And we do need to have a system that is responsive to the needs of people. And I think we need to have a flexible system. And I think we still probably need some more experimentation.
Jack, one of the things that's clearly on the mind of Americans across this country is the issue of taxes, and you've referred to that. Do you favor the kind of suggestion that the Kemp bill, the across-the-board 20% or 30% reduction, that kind of thing? Is that something you think
no,
is
this is the Kemp-Roth bill you're talking about that Mr. Spence is a co-sponsor of. I think we'd have a 30% across-the-board tax reduction. Well, you know, I'd like to promise everybody a 35% tax reduction. I think it'd be wonderful. I'd like to have it. But it's not realistic. The Kemp-Roth bill, you know, was opposed even by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, opposed as being irresponsible because it wasn't tied with any sort of cut in spending, that it would create a $90 billion to $100 billion deficit, that it would just send inflation soaring. Business Week magazine attacked the bill as being totally irresponsible. And I think though that the bill that did pass the House, the $16 billion tax cut, is a reasonable approach. It gives a relief is concentrated in middle income brackets that really have not had much tax relief in recent years. For example, homeowners would no longer have to pay capital gains if they sell their home, and the reason their homes have increased in value is primarily because of inflation. But the Kemp-Roth bill, is, you know, the proponents say it's just like what they did in the Kennedy administration. They cut taxes and increased revenue, but at that time we had a 1.4% inflation rate, and now we're right near closer to 10%. And I think it would just be a totally irresponsible approach.
Well, one of the things about inflation and that has led to the demand or the concern for lower taxes is that people just feel prices have gone out of sight. And we all remember only too recently the difficulty we had in one big item in the household budget, namely food. And the fact that the farmers went on strike, the farmers were very upset. Now, I noticed that there has not been a great deal said in this campaign about agriculture and about farmers. About the attempt, for example, to move back to the family farm as a backbone of the nation, which there's been some move along those lines by the farmers. Where do you stand in terms of the farmers?
Okay, you have basically two types of farm legislation that comes up before Congress. And one type is aimed basically at the farms that are basically agribusiness, these large corporate farms, increasing their profits and so forth. Where I think the emphasis needs to be made is on the family farm. I think there's something inherently valuable in a social sense to the nation about having family farmers. And I've talked to a number of farmers, and they do need relief. And I think we can devise a system that does allow the family farmer to exist and make a reasonable profit and to contribute to society, because these people are the ones who do grow the food we eat.
Jack, how do you go about cutting out the fat? Does Congress decide which things will be cut back, or do they just cut agency budgets back and let them scramble around? How does Congress go about this business of reducing expenditures and cutting back on our tax burden?
Well, obviously it isn't easy. And the system has gotten so bad, in fact, that it makes you wonder that maybe it wouldn't be irresponsible to try just cutting across the board 5%, even 10%, and making managers out of bureaucrats. And that's maybe worth some consideration. But the other thing is to really examine programs. For example, I favor sunset legislation. When you have a new agency created, that it has a limited life, and that life cannot be extended until the program is reviewed and Congress says the problem is still there, we still need the agency, and we'll continue it. Otherwise, we end it. That's one method. Another method is to closely examine existing programs. And the fact that I have a background as an investigative reporter, and I have studied government from the outside and still been able to get to the bottom of things, and I think from the inside I'll be even better able to get to the bottom of things and use those very skills. And I think I can really help root out some waste in government.
That raises an interesting question, because the complexity of modern life, problems aren't just federal, and they're not just state. I mean, they're local, they're state, they're federal, they're all interrelated. How do you see yourself, if you were to be elected in Congress, being able to work with state officials? Is that a real possibility? Is there some way you can do that, coordinate what you do, or is it going to be, just maintained as a separate thing?
I think it'll be fairly easy for me, because I covered the state legislature for 9 years. And, most of the legislators in the 2nd District are Democrats, and they're supporting me. And I frankly expect Dick Riley to be elected governor, and he's, I've known him for years, and he's a friend of mine, and he's someone I'll be able to work with very closely.
Well, that brings us back up to the subject of coattails again, Jack. How are Dick Riley's coattails?
Oh, I think Dick Riley has some coattails. I'm glad he is leading the Democratic ticket this year. I think he's a very strong candidate for governor, and I think he'll make an outstanding governor for South Carolina.
Well, Jack, in just a few seconds that we have left, if you had one question that you could put to Congressman Spence, what would you ask him?
I'd ask him why he votes down the line with the oil companies. There ain't no oil wells in the 2nd District of South Carolina. Let me just add one more thing about Dick Riley, though. Dick Riley this year was a survivor of a Democratic primary in which I frankly think we had 3 outstanding, very capable candidates for governor. It was a nice thing to be able to choose which is the best. And I think that was a good thing for our state this year.
So you're pleased to be on a ticket, you hope, with Dick Riley in the next November election?
Yes.
Okay. Our guest has been Jack Bass, who is a Democratic nominee from the 2nd District in South Carolina. Our interviewer has been Dr. Morris Blachman, who's a professor of government and international studies at the University of South Carolina. And I've been your host, Reed Montgomery. Our program has been University Forum.